So this session now is on a project that we're doing at Marai Centre in UCC called Deep Institutional Innovation for Sustainability and Human Development. So we have 3 speakers. There's a change to the abstract from when we sent in the abstract. We've decided to focus down a little from what we had written on the abstract. So we have 3 speakers here. John Barry, who's in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics in Queen's University in Belfast. We have Joy Clancy, who's from the University of Twente, and Edmund Byrne, who's School of Engineering at University College Cork in Ireland. So the format is going to be, John's going to start off. We have a video from Joy Clancy, who unfortunately there's a clash of sessions, but Joy's going to join us for the last 15 minutes for questions and answers and join the discussion at that stage. And then Ed will come in for the last part of it, and then we'll have discussion. So I'm just going to have a few minutes of introduction of the session and of our project in general. So as I say, the title of the project is Deep Institutional Innovation for Sustainability and Human Development. And we have 3 ideas that are underpinning the project. So the first, which will be no surprise to everyone who's in the international sustainability transitions community, is that we're facing multiple crises at the moment. Climate change is maybe the most pressing, but we've also crises of ecological crises of inequality, crises, and of course the pandemic as well. So there are multiple crises that are happening simultaneously. The second part of our foundations for our project is that at times like this, social institutions such as politics, economics, religion, higher education, technology, gender, are actually failing. They're breaking down. So what the project is aiming at is reimagining these social institutions. And particularly at times of deep turmoil such as the present, there's a risk that sources of toxicity can push changes in a direction that's very detrimental to the public good. So the project is trying to explicitly reimagine social institutions in order to contain toxicity and to empower the forces that can move transitions in the directions of sustainability and greater human development. So in this session then, I say overall in the project, we're looking at what we call 6 social institutions. So as I said, politics, economics, gender, technology, higher education, or religion. In this session, we're going to focus on 3. So John's going to start off by talking about the social institution of technology. Joy Clancy's video will be looking at gender, and then Ed will talk about higher education. And then hopefully, after those 3 sessions, which will last about 10 to 15 minutes each, then we'll have a general discussion with everyone who's on the session. So John, could I ask you to kick off with your intervention?
That's great. Thank you, Ian, and good morning, colleagues. Lovely to join you remotely, and greetings from a very wet Ireland where I am, but that's how we know it's summer in Ireland. The rain is warm. I'm going to frame my contributions around technology, innovation and transformations in turbulent times. And I suppose part to begin to shift our thinking away from one of the issues I want to focus on, which is a friendly critique of socio-technical transitions as a frame. And I think we need to move beyond that to more fundamental structural transformations as opposed to transitions. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of understanding, particularly in technological transformations, of how do we accommodate and embrace agonism, dissent, and indeed conflict around some of those socio-technical transformations. And then also to open up a discussion around the question that's always in a way puzzled me, in that why is it that for the past 250 years, particularly in terms of the Industrial Revolution and technological innovation, particularly in the world of work and production, almost every technological innovation has led to less people working more rather than more people working less. And therefore, to look at the more emancipatory ways in which technological innovation can begin to shift away from a productivist orientation of orthodox economic growth in particular, to open up a new vista of potentially much more profound transformations. So the first part of what I want to say is, as I say, a friendly critique of the socio-technical transitions approach, and essentially around two issues. I think if you look at the literature and the case studies in the socio-technical transitions literature, it's far too state-centric in my perspective. It's very much a top-down sense of elites organizing themselves in stakeholder visioning sessions to map and plan and coordinate a particular transition pathway. I think this is profoundly undemocratic. I think, secondly, it leads or occludes issues of power and power imbalances and inequalities. And in particular, it has a rather naive view of the state as a neutral arbiter, as if it's just there as a referee coordinating between competing interests, and that the state itself, not to be understood as a homogenous entity now, but part of the state, can actually be aligned with certain powerful interests, often economic. So I think empirically, it doesn't offer a realistic understanding of actually how transitions and transformations take place. But also then it's this issue that it's very top down, very technocratic. And of course, I'm partly mindful, as many of us are, that certainly my understanding of this kind of right-wing populism that we see across Europe and North America is in part, part in the xenophobia that goes along, the racism and so on. It's part of reaction by ordinary people against what they see as centralized, top-down public institutions, not defending their interest on the one hand, or imposing rules on them. I'm thinking here in particular of the Gilets Jaunes movement in France, which began as street-level mobilizations of ordinary citizens against the imposition of a carbon tax. So partly my concern here is it's almost like we need to update that old American revolutionary slogan, which was no taxation without representation. I think in this case, it's no carbon taxation without public participation. We need to include more than the usual stakeholders that socio-technical transitions tends to talk about in terms of the conversation, the processes, the institutionalization around the management and imposition of changes in terms of sustainability transformations. And I think part of this is my own normative political perspective, again, which may not be shared by other colleagues, and that's fine, is that largely the socio-technical transitions tends to narrow the scope of transformations possible. To put it bluntly, it's about greening and decarbonizing the status quo, as opposed to allowing any other more radical political economy transformations in the organization of the economy in particular. And I think we need to recognize on this issue of the politics and power at play that there's a dirty politics in the clean energy transition. There are very powerful interests, particularly financialized in terms of the corporate world, whose vested interests go against the decarbonization agenda. And we can see that in the way in which we've delayed for decades the necessary change that perhaps we're on the cusp of seeing now. So for me to finish off this first critique, of a friendly critique of the STT position, is that if we want to orientate ourselves, as I think we absolutely have to, around a just transition. So it's not just about a transition to a low carbon sustainable future, is to ensure that in that neither consumers nor producers, displaced workers are going to be negatively impacted, that we need to include this type of thinking of the issues of power imbalances, the power of economic interests in particular, in order to ensure that essentially we have just transitions in the years ahead. A second area of consideration is the importance of agonism as opposed to antagonism in terms of encouraging, accepting, and not downgrading or dismissing particularly citizens and other groups who may object to technical or policy decisions around sustainability. I mean, too often, those who object to, say, wind farm development are presented as NIMBYs, not in my backyard, which actually we need to remember, if you look at the etymology and the origins of that term NIMBY, it's actually a pro-developer discourse that begins in America, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, in terms of urban development, dismissing local citizens who are objecting against the redevelopment of their area as somehow selfish, not with the program, not accepting in the modern sense of the science of climate change. I'm not saying that there aren't those elements in people who object often to, social or technical aspects of sustainability transitions, but I think we too quickly dismiss that there are problem-solving opportunities in a much more inclusive process of including dissent, of including people who object to some of these changes in particularly technological innovations. And it's something that I think we as academics and those of us involved in, particularly on the technical side of developing new technologies for sustainability, what about upstreaming public involvement from the very start of a project, as opposed to usually it's an end of pipe solution whereby once we've done the project and developed the technology or proof of concept, then we kind of road test it with citizens and stakeholders. I haven't got time to go into it now, but if you're interested in this kind of epistemological or new research orientation, have a look at post-normal science or mode 2 science, which is about much more inclusively and from a very early stage, including non-scientists in the design and the co-design of research projects, which I think is particularly innovative. It's not going to be the case for every technological innovation, but I think some of the issues we find with citizens objecting to policy or indeed technical innovations could be overcome if they're included and their voice and perspective are included much earlier in the process of developing these particular technologies. And the reason why I mention agonism as opposed to antagonism, agonism is a condition where we have opponents who disagree on normative or other grounds. Antagonism is more friend and foe. It's almost like a prelude to violence, which I think is what we want to avoid in democratic and just transitions. And therefore, I think we need to include conflict transformation processes in our thinking around sustainability transitions. And I speak from Northern Ireland, where we have long experience of political violence and therefore long experience of the importance of conflict transformation. And I think it's an underappreciated element of the sustainability transition is we have to recognize there are going to be powerful interests set against these sustainability transitions, but also there will be losers and people who are going to lose out, whether they're displaced coal workers in Germany or Poland or Spain, or here in Ireland in terms of people who make a living from peat cutting and so on, that these people have to be, I think, given the decency of being honest with them, that their particular ways of life or indeed jobs are incompatible with us reaching various sustainability goals. And therefore we need to engage in a process of how do we engage with those people, what are the compensation packages, retraining, and so on. And it is about seeing that actually this conflict transformation process, I think, is better off being built into just transition processes around sustainability rather than policymakers or those in charge of coordinating these just transitions being blindsided by public and particularly localized opposition. The last point I would make in terms of issues around technology is that I do really think we need to decouple technological innovation from its very narrow technological and indeed commercial applications. That's a kind of common sense view. When you think of innovation, it's technology or it's a commercially viable technological innovation, and to encourage social innovation, cultural innovation in low carbon ways of living. Think of it, I don't know who's listening here from the various countries that you're in, and look at your research councils. How much money are various national research councils giving to social innovation in low carbon ways of living? New experiments in terms of not any technological low carbon transition, but changes in behavior, changes in local governance, and so on. And say, why is it we seem to have this inordinate amount of research and attention to technological innovation as opposed to social innovation? And again, this loops back then to this critique I would have of socio-technical innovation, which majors heavily on the technological side. Part of my reason for raising this particular issue of a critical examination of technologically focused innovation is to enable a more pluralist field of analysis to include social. But it also is that I do think that there is almost science fiction type technological innovations being promoted as a way of dealing with our sustainability dilemma. Geoengineering, solar radiation management, almost terraforming the planet. And these are given very serious consideration by governments, research councils, just in terms of the money. And you weigh that up and measure it against, well, there are non-technological solutions to many of the problems we face, particularly in terms of energy, climate, and the biodiversity crisis. I mean, one way of putting this point, colleagues, is Elon Musk and his ideas of colonizing Mars are given serious attention in the media, in academia, in policy circles, certainly in America. And yet, if you dare question that capitalism itself is part of the root problem of what we're facing, therefore we need to transcend capitalism, you're seen as utopian and naive. And for me, this is a major problem, because it means that for many of us, and this is a phrase that some of you will be familiar with, we've now reached the crazy stage where it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So I want to put out there this idea of social, political economy transformation, which is often non-technological, as part of the solution, portfolio that we should be looking at. A second point in terms of raising this critical question around detaching ourselves from a purely technological focus is that I think it can lead to a depolitical and a de-ethicized approach to the sustainability transition. I think here that this is, again, part of what we see in some dominant strands of socio-technical transitions thinking and analysis. Again, it can blind us to the importance of engaging in behavioral change research and proposals, change in the structure of our economy, again, a major political ask, changing in a way, to put it in a more ethical frame, that what we need to manage is not the earth. That's what I have a deep ethical suspicion and worry about these geoengineering proposals in particular. It's about human beings managing the earth in a way to suit our particular needs. Whereas actually what we really need to manage, and we have always really needed to manage, is not to manage the earth, but to manage our relationship to the earth. Now that's a non-technological, that's a deeply cultural, political governance issue, that we need to manage our relationship to the earth in terms of having a more sustainability metabolism and equilibrium with the planet and its life-supporting systems. And it does seem to me then, just to finish, that part of this more political, ethicized approach to understanding technological innovation would bring us back to that question I raised at the beginning of why is it that we're not deliberately and politically deploying our technological innovation to ensure that we have more people working less rather than less people working more, and that we're not simply mobilizing technological innovation to increase productivity and efficiency, that we're actually using technological innovation to begin to open up a space of the unfinished revolution of democracy, in my view, is that why should democracy end at the factory gate or the office door? Where do we see the serious discussion of cascading democratic norms? Of course, most of us live in democratic societies, but why is it when most people enter the world of work, they're in despotisms? They are in non-democratic situations. I'm not saying this would be appropriate for every productive space or sphere of work, but I do think we need to move away from simply thinking that technology is in the service of the status quo, that technological innovation in the face of our planetary emergency can open up new areas of bringing, as I say, democratic norms into our workplaces. So for me, if you want a nice phrase for how to encompass what I'm saying, I think in terms of the transition to a less unsustainable society, we need to democratize production and socialize consumption. The latter point, I simply mean to move away from seeing that consumption has to be individualized and to, if you like, move away from individual consumption of books, for example, and more to libraries, or to move away from individual private car transportation, more to public transportation. So socializing consumption, I think, is partly a technological issue, but seriously, it's a much bigger political economy question about how we organize both production and consumption. And so, colleagues, I think we also need to take on board that turbulence and change can be opportunities. In the same way, dissent should be welcomed, particularly if it's non-violent. And I'm absolutely of the view that the types of transitions we need will not be made in boardrooms or in policy-making circles. They will have to require the engagement of citizens, often mobilizing on the streets. Absolutely a non-negotiable issue for me is that, so it's non-violent. That's a democratic right of citizens. So I think for me, it's that non-violent disagreement. That's what democracy means in our turbulent age. And I'll just end with a quote from George Bernard Shaw, a great Irish playwright, which I think encompasses the challenge and the opportunities ahead. George Bernard Shaw said this, and we've forgiven the sexism of the time that he was writing in. He said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man adapts the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends upon the unreasonable man." So, colleagues, I leave you with that thought. How can we be democratically and non-violently unreasonable? Thank you.
I think it's an interesting question to ask about what institutional changes are going to take place as a result of quite traumatic events and particularly the example that we are having now. What sort of deep transition can we expect? And my particular area is in the area of gender, although my specialization is in energy, so I'm more an energy specialist than a gender specialist. But gender is certainly a meta institution, and gender is like any institution. It's not set in concrete. It does change. It changes generally slowly over time, but there are instances of disruption that caused significant changes in gender. And when we talk about gender, we're talking about roles, the jobs that are assigned by a particular community to women and to men. And I use the term community rather than society, because within societies there are a range of communities. And within one society, you can have different roles assigned to women and men by different communities. So I think that's also an important thing to keep in mind. But some examples that came to my mind when thinking about traumatic disruptions in society, which brought changes in gender role, certainly was the Second World War, when many women entered the formal economy. And I think it would be incorrect to say that this was the first time women were in the economy, because women have always played a part in the informal economy. Or they'd done the same thing in the First World War, but I think the significance of the two events is that after the Second World War, women were more reluctant to return to being homemakers. So that's when you begin to see very significant changes, I think, in gender roles and women's demands for changes in gender relations. The other type of event is environmental disaster. These two unfortunate types of events bring change. That an example from an environmental disaster is the tsunami that was in the Pacific region a few years ago, in which many fishermen unfortunately died because they were out at sea when the tsunami hit. And this then forced women into coastal communities having to take on that work, that they learned how to fish. They then became the providers for their family. Okay, that's a bit gloomy that it's in traumatic events, but if we look at it also in a historical perspective, there's anecdotal evidence of change. I'm sure all of you at some stage in your childhood of your grandparents have said to you, when I was your age, boys didn't do that sort of things and girls didn't do that sort of thing. So we know that things do change gradually over time. Academic research also shows that gender roles are changing, but not necessarily as fast as some might like, or some are probably pleased with the not so fast change. There is something called in the UK called the British Attitude Survey, which monitors social change in the UK with in-depth surveys every 10 years and smaller ones every year. And one thing that shows over time is that men appear to have an apparent lack of talent in operating washing machines. So not a lot is changing there, but also on the other hand, women are also not grabbing the stage that when it comes to, certainly in the UK, of course, that it's men are still responsible for 75% of all small household repairs. Now, what I've just described are actually gender roles. They're not about gender relations, and gender relations is a lot more complex because it's to do with power. It's to do with power relations. It's who decides what, about whom, and how. And so that in most societies, it's men who still hold the reins of power, and this is at all levels in society. But I also, at this point, want to say that we shouldn't think of gender as a binary. It's not. It's too simplistic to think of it as women and men. It's in a social setting. It's much more complex than that. The society is divided into a whole range of different social categories, of which one person will exhibit many different variations of class, of income, of ethnicity, of religion, age, life cycle, and sexual orientation. And all of those are also moderated by some of the other meta-institutions that are on discussion in this forum. And I think that's important to notice. And I think that what is drawing attention to this, it's something that occurs in academic research, but in a wider society, both the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement are drawing attention to the whole difference in range between different communities. And so you can have a white woman who is more privileged and has more power than, for say, a black man who lives across the street. So I think if we look at these changes to gender power relations over time. So now I'm thinking more about about power here. Is one thing from here that we can look at historically is the whole Votes for Women movement, which was to get women to have a greater say over the composition of their legislature, who controlled their lives. So it's men controlling the lives of women, particularly in relation, I think one of the strong movements was about your control over your body and particularly how many children you had. So now we're thinking beginning of the 20th century. And women wanted their legislature to be more representative of their empathy. And once the Votes for Women was achieved, then this has evolved over time into a much broader movement for what could be called gender equality. And equality is not about equal numbers. Gender is about recognizing difference. And I think that again comes back to my description of gender as being much more intersectional, much more than a binary. It's about recognizing difference in needs, aspirations, constraints, and capacities. And I come back to the comment I made about equal numbers, because having equal numbers of men on women on a committee is not going to solve gender power relations. It's rooted in culture. And if you're in a culture where women don't speak in front of men, having equal numbers of women on a committee is not going to make any difference. And I also would say that it's not women's sole responsibility to change gender relations. It's an equal responsibility. And I would in getting anybody to give up power, as we can see in the political sphere at the moment, is not going to be easy. So you have to show the person who is giving up power that there is something in it for them. So in this context, I think men also have to see the benefits of a much more equal society, of a much more shared set of responsibilities. And I was particularly intrigued by a piece of research that comes from Ghana by the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, in which they talked to women and men in Ghana who were running small businesses. And what surprised me was that the men talked about the stress of responsibility, not necessarily for their business, but for their family. And this I thought was a real sea change in men beginning to talk in that context about how they feel. And so when their wives also started to earn an income, then the pooled resources were discussed in together, and decisions began to be taken more in a shared way, relieving both the stress for the husband, but also for the woman that she gained in her status and in her responsibility for making decisions. And that brings me to our last remark, because I was struck then by one of the comments that I read in the paper that Marcus shared with me, was that hopefully out of this transition will come a new construction of gender, which is less destructive to both women and men. And I think you couldn't ask for a better resolution that would come out, say, of this pandemic or any other major disruption to society. So thank you for listening.
Ian, you're muted.
Thanks very much, Joy. I think there's a common theme I was saying, I think, between what John was saying in the first session and what you've been saying, really about the power struggle, you know, and the struggle of power having to be made explicit, you know. I think one of the things in the project as well, there's a couple of issues when we talk about reimagining gender, and you put it very well there in terms of transition requires a transition in the conceptualization of gender or the construction of gender. Because toxicity is a big issue in the project. The idea of toxicity can drive transitions in a direction that's very detrimental. And I think current gender construction has a huge toxicity already built into it in terms of violence and inequality. So once again, if people would like to put comments in the chat box as we go along, we're going to go on to Ed now, Ed Byrne, in the School of Engineering in University College Cork, and Ed's going to talk now about reimagining higher education. Ed, over to you.
Cheers. Thank you, Ian. So maybe taking up from some of the previous speakers' themes, I'm going to talk about education, as Ian suggested. I suppose the deep institutional transitional change we speak of and advocate here speaks none more appropriately than to the domain of education, and specifically in this context among ourselves to higher education. I suppose firstly because education, formal and informal, is foundational in shaping our view of the world around us. It does this not just through acquisition of necessary facts and instrumental knowledge, but also in the application of many transferable skills, such as in the realm of communication, teamworking, dealing with complexity, and so on. But also through educational attitudes or values, the pervading ethic through which education is both developed and delivered, including ideally the explicit consideration and critical development of students' own values. Secondly, higher education offers a unique and key intervention point for transformational change. Consequently, academics have a privileged and powerful opportunity to help promote or challenge various conceptions, worldviews, paradigms, and ideas, and more importantly, help young minds to develop the tools and critical awareness to do so themselves in ways which shape and influence them across their future lives and careers. And thirdly, if higher education is not the preserve of authentically based critical independent thinking in the public square, at times supporting contrarian, provocative, and change-provoking ideals and realities than one dares to ponder the risk for society at large. So, having argued for education as a potential key driver to evoke deep institutional change and transition, I propose to show how our formal higher education system is largely posited within and in line with the dominant societal paradigm, and why this is deeply problematic and how this might change under 3 particular headings. So these might be characterized as 1, a paradigm of economics, 2, a paradigm of knowledge and thinking, and 3, a paradigm of pedagogy and teaching. So first, let's reflect on the paradigm of economics. Horses get €6,000 state support a year, while an arts student gets €4,000. This is a quote from an Irish parliamentarian, Richard Boyd Barrett, in 2020, reflecting the fact that in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the Irish state used the crisis as an opportunity to divest from higher education sector. So according to the Government Commission Castle's report from 2016, state-funded higher education supports fell from 73% of core income in 2008 to just 50% in 2015. And this trend has continued apace as private sources of income, including philanthropy and visiting non-EU student fees, have been promoted to make up the bulk of funding, leaving underfunded and essentially privatized university sector subject to the vicissitudes of the markets and global pandemics. So this is not just regretful or a risk to continued economic well-being, but downright dangerous, in fact. So at a previous Deep Institutional Innovation for Sustainability forum held just last month, former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, referred to the incredible value that a newly created public education system had on her and other contemporaries in Northern Ireland in being instrumental in helping articulate against inequality and discrimination. Indeed, it was pointed out at the recent funeral of John Hume, Ireland's Martin Luther King, according to Bill Clinton, and perhaps her greatest ever statesman, that Hume was in fact among the first cohort of school students to benefit from free public secondary level education when it was finally extended from Great Britain to Northern Ireland in the 1950s. So mindful of the saying that there is no such thing as a free lunch, it surely behoves states to ensure that robust higher education systems are maintained through strong public funding streams, as opposed to reverting to earlier models of personal and corporate endowment. If the recent pandemic has emphasized anything, it is the value and necessity of strong public institutions. So the prevailing paradigm of economics aligns with the dominant societal paradigm, which the philosopher Edgar Morin calls a paradigm of reduction and disjunction or separation. So this worldview sees the prime function of graduates as consumers of an educational offering which can help fuel economic growth. Thus, whilst core state funding is reduced for universities in Ireland, the shortfall is partially replaced by monies which higher education institutes must compete for by setting up new work-based skills programs to produce the right type of graduate. And this is endorsed by a supportive multinational sector. So as one Craig Barrett, who's the ex-Intel CEO, opined on a state broadcaster radio interview previously, using revealing metaphorical language, he suggested we should be about transforming the universities into wealth-creating machines. So alas, machines do not function well when tolerances of their component parts diverge from strictly defined parameters, The second paradigm is one of knowledge and thinking. The dominant societal paradigm of separation has led to an ever-increasing siloization of our universities, disciplines, and research programs. So contrary to the hopes of C.P. Snow to see healing between the two cultures, many of our institutions and the research and state agencies which fund them seem to be contriving to create what might be considered multiversities, forever learning more and more about less and less. Nevertheless, the major impending crisis of unsustainability, as revealed in the deeply interconnected domains of climate, water, energy, food, biodiversity, human health and well-being, as well as economic and social inequality, and even in the global pandemic, itself in part an increasingly likely outcome of humankind's incessant encroachment on the natural world, all require a response born of an education which requires respective actors to see the value of working with others and go beyond narrow disciplinary limits. Transcendent transdisciplinary approaches are the only rational response in this context. As satisfactorily addressing these deep, interconnected and complex issues in our contemporary society requires not just a range of expert disciplinary knowledge bases working together in disciplinary humility, nor even just of local and indigenous knowledge bases to complement expert knowledge. But it also requires, in addition to such knowledge, an appreciation of the role of values and ethics and the nature of the human condition, and a well-developed conception of human flourishing. So as Bertrand Russell put it in 1926, we must have some concept of the kind of person we wish to produce before we can have any definite opinion as to the education which we consider best. Complexity, too, is at the heart of a paradigm of knowledge which goes beyond reductionism. So as Edgar Morin puts it himself, we're blind to the problem of complexity, and this blindness is part of our barbarism. Only complex thought will allow us to civilize our knowledge. An industrial ecologist and engineer, John Ehrenfeld, concurs, suggesting that the big messes are all a result of our failures to recognize complexity and act accordingly. So what does such an education look like? Well, in describing all human and natural systems, which include environmental, economic, and socio-technical, it embraces complexity, inherent interconnection, emergence, risk and inherent uncertainty, and complementary dualistic agonism, as John has mentioned, over reductionist either-or antagonism. More importantly, too, it embraces context. So as Morin put it, thought which simplifies has become the barbarity of science. However, we can foresee a science which brings about possibilities of self-knowledge, which recognizes the mystery in all things, which does not order but organizes, does not manipulate but communicates, and does not direct but animates. The final paradigm is one of pedagogy and teaching. Again, the dominant society paradigm of separation seeks to promote separation in our teaching, delivery, and curricula. We divide our programs into semesters, modules, courses, topics, and so on, much for good, while we as engineers usefully seek to reductively remove context as we seek to uniquely solve the power required to pump a liquid through a pipeline or the forces a bridge can withstand, for example. Technology has allowed the metaphor of bite-sized pieces of knowledge and learning to go further with bits, bytes, and megabytes of knowledge, which our students can then consume on their all-you-can-eat data devices. Moreover, the necessities of the pandemic have played right into this dominant techno-optimistic paradigm. The solution lies in technological prowess. Students can now learn, and perhaps more efficiently and effectively, it is felt, in a screen-mediated environment, which is deemed as good as, or nearly as good as, face-to-face. Thus, the pragmatic outcome of the pandemic has been that we're all further separated from each other and denied a key aspect of the learning process: in-person lecture-student and peer-to-peer interaction. In truth, technology offers a poor substitute to being physically present, while it further promotes inequality. There are socio-economic and perhaps gender issues at play in how people access and engage with such technologies. And if or when we manage to engage in some face-to-face teaching over the coming year or years, it too will be carried out via social distance rules of engagement mediated via masks, visors, partitions, and other objects of social separation. In truth, however, we know deep down that education is fundamentally a social process. And in our classrooms, either virtual or real, the more we seek to bridge language, cultural, experiential, age, and other relevant barriers between staff and students and between students themselves, the more this becomes self-apparent. So to echo an earlier point, much ultimately comes down to one's conception of inherent values in learning. Might these be closer to Newman's idea of a university, or an alternative conception of an oven-ready graduate factory? Ethicist Margaret Suttrop published a paper on the myth of value-free education in 2015, suggesting if we want to raise obedient, loyal, hardworking people who follow orders without argument, then schools that use rote methods and authoritarian teachers are in every sense justifiable. Suttrop works at the University of Tartu in Estonia, which is actually closer to the Belarusian border than I am to the British border in Ireland, just about 350 kilometers up the road from Cork. She goes on, it's in the power of teachers as values educators to spur students to become conscious of their values, to give them skills to reflect upon and to discuss and support students' moral development towards the emergence of their own personal core values. Indeed, in contemporary education for sustainable development discourses and literature, there's been a well-developed and progressive shift away from traditional and earlier understandings of ESD, from raising knowledge and awareness around environmental sciences and green technologies to embrace broader social and ethical issues, as well as developing understandings of complexity, context, normativity, risk, and uncertainty via transdisciplinary approaches, including an engineering education for sustainable development. The outworkings of this paradigm have deep and significant implications, not just for how we teach and do research, but how we envisage and organize our institutions, including the interrelations and values we place between and around respective disciplinary fields. There is, I feel, therefore, some cause for some grounded hope in our academies and across higher education. I'll conclude with some words from a paper I've just published in the European Journal of Engineering Education with colleagues from Seville and Cork. The contemporary engineer requires competencies not just in the core knowledge domain, but also in transferable skills and in attitudes, professional values, ethical frameworks. While the professional values domain cuts across the other two, nevertheless, it is here where engineering education has traditionally been found wanting. The successful incorporation of these components into the curriculum requires new, more student-centered teaching and learning approaches relative to the traditional. Specifically, this entails the education of engineers capable of making decisions which routinely take into account the social, ethical, and moral consequences of these decisions. This includes the deployment of the sustainability ethic throughout one's practice. In this way, the expansive role that engineers can and ought play must increase, not just in addressing complex problems with societal and natural ecological dimensions, but also in the very framing of such problems. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Ed. So a lot of food for thought there too. I think from the perspective of the project, part of the reason that we had John and Joy and Ed speaking on three very different topics, so technology, reimagining gender, reimagining higher education. I hope you can see from the contributions from each of the three of them that all of these social institutions influence one another. They're very deeply embedded in one another. And therefore, when we come to think about processes of change, the dynamics of change, reimagining all of these institutions at the same time is important and vital, in fact. So I'm going to post on the chat, the website for the DIIS project, because we've also been looking in previous discussions about reimagining economics, reimagining religion, reimagining politics. So if you're interested, you can go on there and see some of the videos from previous discussions. So I'd like to open it up now for questions. I think, are we able to admit people? Cara, are we able to admit people on video? Cara,
yes, we can.
We are, yeah. So
we can allow up to 9 people can share their screen together.
Okay, so I think Amy Nguyen was asking a question there. Amy, are you willing to come on, or would you just like to?
For approval. Yes, I have a question and a comment. So a question for both John and Joy. That's on one hand, John, you say about democratizing the production of sustainable transition or resources like energy or food or water. And on the other hand, there are idea of like even the democratization happens, even we have equal voices in the participation, in the participant, the power relations that of the different interests and different discourse that shift the roles and the power between stakeholders and participants in that democratization process could also make it not really democratized. What are you thinking about that? What kind of democracy that could have address that power asymmetry? And or is there any other way to address that power asymmetry? Yeah, so that's my question, and my comment for Edmund is that I agree with the disciplinary silos that currently having in institution of education institution as well as journal, even journal publishing is also currently categorized by discipline rather than around the issue and the topic of sustainable transition. So what do you think about the way to address that? Whether we, as a researcher, whether the research institution should restructure to disciplinary and culture, or as a researcher we should have others develop our capabilities to reach out to other disciplines, and what are your recommendations for that for a young researcher like me in the field? Yeah, thank you.
So Joy and John, would you like to come in on the first part of that, and then Ed on the last part? So
go ahead, Joy.
Okay. I read your comment in your question in the comment, and I've been thinking about it since you posed it. That's why I haven't typed anything. That's a tough question that you can't really answer in 2 minutes. But I was thinking about democracy, of course, is not only a process that takes place in elections. I think democratic processes are linked very strongly to equality. And I think that in grassroots movements, you have a much stronger association with equality. Although, well, I hope so, because what my research showed me is that even in renewable energy technology, is that the guys tend to take over. So Ed, this is for you in education as well, is to not push the women out. And so I think one hopes for the best, but all processes are imperfect. But I do think at grassroots level, that's where it starts, and that you do get, think about all the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter, or even go back to Votes for Women. They were all grassroots movements that start the process of change. So that's where I hope that things will do. But Ed, I'd liked what you had to say about the education system, because I do think that also has a significant role to play. Also for me, I mean, I went to working class family, and it'd be interesting. I haven't seen the evaluation, but it'd be interesting to take a look at what in London is doing. That's my alma mater, and they are deliberately targeting students who come both from an ethnic minority family and to also for students who from any background who've never had a member of the family go to university before, even today. So I think, and that's an interesting thing, because when you look at the cohort, when you go into the university, the diversity in that university is quite something. So I think that's an interesting approach to change. But I did also take your whole point about the whole sort of move towards the privatization of universities. It's no longer a state body. So I think there's a lot you had to say I could talk about, but we should give someone else a chance. So I think it's John, I think was it.
Yes, perhaps if I could. Thank you, Min, for your question. I'll begin by saying that I don't think the problems of our democratic societies can all be solved by greater democratization. And that's a much bigger issue, and it's a naive perspective, almost akin to this kind of technological optimism that we'll find an app for these problems that we face. We won't. And we must even recognize that democracy always contains within it the processes that we may fail. So there's no guarantee. That's the issue of struggle. I would certainly echo what Joy said, that I think we have a much too emaciated conception of democracy. It's not just about elections or political parties. It is about living norms of self-governance, of collective self-governance throughout our lives, which is why I think our democracies are only semi-democracies, because we have in most of our working lives people living in dictatorships. They may be benign, they may not be necessarily harming people, but they're certainly not democracies. So Why is it that, we don't extend those democratic norms throughout society? What we have maybe are partly liberal capitalist representative democratic institutions, but what we don't have is full democracy. The best example of that, if you want, very eloquently written back in the 19th century, is by Alexis de Tocqueville and his book Democracy in America, where he very eloquently outlines the necessity of extending democracy beyond the institutional level. But for me, part of the response I would have in terms of, you're quite right, in terms of raising issues of power imbalances can be sometimes amplified in quasi or so-called democratic fora, where if you've experienced, university conferences like this, or even, town hall public meetings, it's often alpha males that dominate the conversation. And therefore, even, democratic participative processes have to be organized in such a way that we make sure that all voices are heard, that each voice counts for one and none for more than one. But for me, we cannot say we live in fully democratic societies without economic democracy and equality. I mean, this is part of the problem. How can we say that we have a genuine democratic political system when we have vast inequities of power, of knowledge, and so on?
Yeah.
So for me, this is the old Marxist in me, and I have to say I'm an unreconstructed Marxist lentilist. I'm a watermelon green when it really comes down to it. That we really have to democratize production, address the fundamental injustices that are often intersectional in terms of race, gender, and class. And that, for me, the kind of tepid language of socio-technical transitions and stakeholder involvement does not begin to even address those much more profound structural political economy issues, which you really have to address. Because I, for one, am not interested as a father, as a citizen, or as an academic in greening capitalism. Capitalism is the problem. We need to find ways of transcending it as opposed to decarbonizing it.
Thank you. Yeah.
And Ed?
I agree. So my current PhD project is also about the not democratizing, but I look into the proposal of governance in transition, currently talking a lot about justice and democratization, but actually as I'm taking a more governmentality perspective, that's saying about like currently the power and of the knowledge that's shaping the power relation between different actors as well in the democratization process. So this is not really democratized. And so maybe, as you say, that we need to talk about how to emancipate the grassroots, as Joy said as well, that how to emancipate the grassroots to express their expectation and their representation, so that it can help with the emancipating some representation or some ideas or some knowledge that can be alternative to the current political economy of neoliberalism and capitalism. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And Edmund, do you have any say on your subject?
Yeah. Okay. I might just pick up on a point that Joy made just first of all, and then I'll address your points. I mean, just Joy's talking about the gender issue and then how it feeds into education, and certainly in our discipline and profession and so on, we beat ourselves up over the gender imbalance in engineering and attracting females into engineering. And I think it's interesting to look at some work from, I think, Imperial College London previously, which actually showed that they surveyed first-year engineers and found that the number one driver for choosing engineering among females was actually to make the world a better place. That was their number one. Whereas among males, it was more things like solving problems and developing technologies and earning some money and so on. So I think we owe ourselves in all our disciplines, particularly in the STEM disciplines, to maybe reorient to a more fit for purpose, perception, self-definition of what we're about as engineers or scientists or whatever our discipline is. And then that can actually, open the floodgates, let's say, or to incorporate the broader context rather than just be solving narrowly defined problems and so on. So I think we owe it to ourselves. So education, as I say, is not value free, so that's just to that point. In terms of I think it's a really good point in terms of the actual working together, the rational response to our crisis of unsustainability, our transdisciplinary approaches, yet our organizations and funding structures and so on are set up against that. And that particularly mitigates against younger academics who heaven knows have a difficult position in terms of precariousness and all the rest, and it seems to be just becoming more and more difficult for younger academics all the way along. But I think, as John suggests, he's a great proponent for disciplinary promiscuity. And I think we all have, let's say, our day jobs within our disciplines. And of course, transdisciplinarity does not call for the breaking down of disciplinarity. No transdisciplinarity without disciplinarity, as the motto goes. But it behoves us that we can, outside the normal disciplinary work that we do, to reach out to others, and they kind of just emerge like mushrooms in overnight. In my own experience, from some local conferences on sustainability and climate change and so on, I've come into contact with sociologists, and sometimes we just work, and geographers and so on, but we work in a sort of a transgressive means, just at a bottom up means, to do some work, and then lots of people just appear, and there are communities around there. And that then can be helped by top-down initiatives. So in our own university, we have, and a lot of universities have these kind of goals at the moment. We have a 6-point plan of what we call a connected curriculum, and two of those points, or two of those pillars, are sustainability and transdisciplinarity. And I imagine that some of that, at least, has been influenced by some of the work that goes across our university from the top down. And then we have, funding agencies at a European Union level, at a national and international levels, they recognize that these broader issues of sustainability or unsustainability and so on require, and they use the language sometimes of cross and transdisciplinarity and these other things. They don't really know, you feel that they don't really know what they're talking about in some respects, but it's up to us to show them as academics. And we don't have all the answers clearly, but by working together, at least we can stumble in the dark and maybe find create some outputs and so on, whether it be publications, books, collaborations, and so on, in those few journals that will actually produce these things. But then that puts us in a position that we can actually be leaders in terms of looking for some of that funding. And I think maybe the initiative that Ian is leading, and indeed Brian O'Gallagher, who's here, he's a director of a national research centre in Ireland called MARI, Marine and Renewable Energy. Traditionally, the folks have been on energy and technology, but increasingly there's a broader scope, and that's recognised. I think that's showing leadership, and that's showing that's pushing out those boundaries that then ultimately, the powers that be at a top-down level will actually come looking for that. So I think it's a sort of as has been mentioned before, a slow process at times, some of this stuff, the long miles and so on, but at certain point things come together quite rapidly perhaps, and that day will come, and those days are rapidly coming, I'd suggest. So I think it's something well worth doing. It's not an either or as well. You can do your disciplinary work, but also I think it's worth reaching out within your own university as well as others. And I think things, you'll find a lot of similar fellow travelers, let's say, on that path.
Okay, we're going to have to start keeping an eye on time now. We've got about 15 minutes left, and there's quite a few questions coming in. Could we gather a few? Nico, Laura, and Brian, are you able to come on? Okay, is Nico there? Brian, do you want to go ahead and ask your question first, and then we'll...
Sure, it touches on some of the points as well that Olga and Nico raise. I suppose I suffer from bouts of techno-optimism, and I've been involved in many years with stakeholder engagement and those processes. And so while I recognise the points that John makes in terms of the flaws in those systems and approaches, the question of timing is a critical one. You know, we're facing an emergency, and so the need for fast response is a tricky one to tease out. And it comes up in some of the later questions. In my question, it was related to harnessing these movements, these grassroots movements that have been talked about: Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Fridays for the Future, very clear expressions of discontent with the status quo. But, you know, moving from the streets to institutional change, how do we harness that energy? And how do we harness it before it dissipates? Because there can be a tendency for these movements to ebb and flow depending on what context is taking place at the time. So my question is about harnessing the grassroots movements so that we can make the very significant changes that we've recognized, identified, and are discussing here.
So could we gather a few questions and then ask the presenters to respond? Nico, would you like to come on?
Yes, I'm on. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Great. Yeah, so I'll just repeat the question I also wrote down. Essentially, what you hear oftentimes is that you know, these top-down, very technocratic approaches to transition are sort of a necessary evil, that we can't get around them because there isn't enough time left to fix these issues. And I just wonder, how do you respond to that? Because I feel that's just an easy way out to kind of preserve power structures, but how do you you know, convince people otherwise, essentially?
Okay, thanks, Nico. And Laura? We can, yeah. Okay, so let's see, John, do you want to go first? And then we'll
yes. Thank you, Wayne. I suppose I'll maybe start with Laura. This is the main area of my research, and also connects with a question in the chat box there from Olga, is that I'm absolutely convinced that orthodox economic growth is an ideology. It's an ideology that serves the interest of an elite. When you talk to most ordinary citizens about economic growth, they don't know what it is. They act, to the extent that they do, they translate it into public services and employment. So if that's what citizens want, services and employment, can we do this without economic growth? And I say the empirical evidence is there. We can decouple human flourishing and the provision of our needs of our citizens without necessarily capital accumulation and endless economic growth. But it is an ideological struggle. And where most of us are placed, for those of you who are academics, we're at the heart of that ideological struggle. Most economics and management departments, to me, are propaganda institutions. They are promoting one particular perspective on the economy, which is basically a pro-capitalist one. I'm not saying that necessarily to be a Marxist-Leninist like me, but surely we should have pluralism in the teaching of this particular discipline, which to me is the master discipline of our contemporary age. We need to dethrone neoclassical or capitalist economics from being the only or dominant one that we have in our universities. And that's where I do welcome engagements with the degrowth movement. My own view is that we should perhaps be a growth. In other words, we should be proposing public policies that may produce some economic growth, because after all, even from a degrowth perspective or ecological perspective, not every part of the economy has to contract. So long as the macro level planetary boundaries are not being transgressed, or the social floors, you know, the Kate Raworth's idea of the kind of donut economics, we can have growth in libraries, but maybe degrowth in nuclear weapons. I think that's pretty good. So I think part of the problem with degrowth is that it's not sufficiently differentiating which parts of our economy do we want to grow and which parts do we want to degrow. It is at the macroeconomic level that it makes sense, but for most citizens, what they want to know is at the more micro level in terms of where the jobs are and the public services that they want. But it is absolutely, to answer Olga's question, it is an ideological struggle, and you begin by recognizing that economic growth is not objective. Neoclassical economics is not objective or neutral. To answer Brian and also Nico and Therese's question there in the chat box, the pandemic has shown us how quickly states and citizens can move. Many of us are living in societies that have declared, either at the local level or national level, climate and ecological emergencies. So where I live in Northern Ireland, our local assembly has declared an emergency. The Irish Parliament declared one last year, the British Parliament, French, many local councils across Europe. And yet these are mere rhetorical, political, cheap forms of talk. What we see in the pandemic, the state intervening, furloughing workers in places like Spain and Ireland, temporarily nationalizing public healthcare systems, mortgage holidays, and so on, the temporary suspension of business as usual, that's what an emergency looks like. So for me, we must never accept that neoliberal doctrine that there isn't money available. The state can always, if the political will is there. I mean, it's an echo, if you like, of an older phrase that many be familiar with. Why is it there's always money for war, but not money for education? So hopefully there's a lesson from this pandemic, particularly in terms of the patent public support for, certainly in Britain and Ireland, what's been called building back better. Why on earth do we want to go back to normal? Normal was the problem. Normal was ecocidal. Normal was increasing inequalities in our society. So the pandemic has shown us that states and citizens can move fairly quickly when there's leadership. There was uneven, admittedly, recognition by politicians and citizens of listening to the science. That kind of Greta Thunberg Extinction Rebellion demand that let's listen to the science. That should give us some hope. So I'd like to think that out of the pandemic, this gives us an indication that societies can move pretty quickly, but only if we move beyond these hollow declarations of political, ecological and biodiversity emergencies and begin to see some determined action. Now, I'm under no illusion that the default position is against this. I mean, the voices demanding a return to normality, particularly in the context of returning to austerity, are quite strong. So again, we're back to the issue of political struggle and the issue that Brian raised in terms of these mobilizations we see around the world: Extinction Rebellion, Youth Strike for Climate, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. There's a key issue here in seeing that these are intersectionally connected. They are all connected in a way against the current political economy of capitalism, globalizing capitalism on the one hand, and a pale liberal representative democracy on the other, which both prop up a patriarchy, a legacy of imperialism that Juan was talking about. So how do we connect up these struggles to see that they are part of challenging the current system? And that's not going to be easy. And one way we can begin by doing that is those of us who want to be allies to these movements is to listen to them. I think too often we're talking down, even if we're a friend of these movements. We need to actually have a much more humble getting alongside these movements, showing, what your demand as a unionized worker who's going to lose your job in the coal field, I can show you how it's connected to Black Lives Matter. Now that may be a jump for most people, but I think we can. That's part of the work that I think we should do as privileged knowledge workers, in my view, as academics, often having this kind of overview of what's going on in society. Get out of the academy, certainly get out of our disciplinary silos, and begin to see that part of our privileged position is to help in this greatest existential challenge our species faces, and to see that all of these are connected in different ways. Indigenous struggles in the global south, in particular, the Via Campesina and the peasant movements trying to reclaim land. These are all part of the same, if you like, large terrain of transformations we see bubbling up. And the danger is, just to begin to wind up, as Brian quietly recognized, is that we've seen this in Occupy, we've seen this in other previous movements, where there's this effervescent upsurge of activism, and then it dissipates when things don't happen. How do we basically connect these movements to give them a longevity and to begin to institutionalize them, not in the sense of connecting them to liberal parliamentary democracy? So for me, that's part of the issue. It's a rather easy thing to say in a grandiose statement, as I've just said, But I do think each of us as academics, as privileged knowledge workers, what are we going to do at this moment? Is it enough simply to produce peer-reviewed academic research, as opposed to actually beginning to get out in our communities and societies, including policymakers and our business community, our faith communities, to begin to see this is the job of academia in the 21st century? Here ends the secular sermon.
Thanks, John. Time is really against us here. I would like to hear a few more voices. I know we're not going to get the questions answered, but I think it's interesting just for us to hear what's on the minds of the other people in the room. Juan, Therese, Pernilla, and Helena, can you come on and just say very briefly what your thought and your question was? As I say, we'll not be able to answer them, but maybe I'll ask one or two of the presenters just to give a minute's response. So Pernilla, would you like to start? Keep it brief, please.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted. Yeah, so my response was really in relation to Helene's comment, but also as I saw sort of connecting the different presentations, specifically when we think about universities as institutions that uphold all of the above. So capitalism, a patriarchal system, it's based on colonialism and imperial sort of knowledge production and so on. What is the role and responsibility of individual researchers in that? I think that's interesting, but it's also problematic because we're at the whim of funding and an increasingly neoliberalized system and so on. So that was more of a comment on that, I think, really in relation to Helene's comment.
Thanks very much, Pernilla. Helena?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, hi everyone. Very nice. I was pleased to see the topic of your session. I've been thinking for at least 2 years now that maybe I should quit academia and become an activist instead. And I think a lot of us are thinking about, are we in the right place? Are we spending our precious time on the right things? Especially as I feel I have no influence and no power, and so many issues need to be addressed. But I talked to a senior professor and asked him this question, and he said, really, you should just use your privilege of having a page up in academia to spend time on what's important and try to then support, the knowledge making on these questions that can help also play the long game of building up capacity in society. So I think there's a short game and a long game, and the more we can make time for both the institutional work of creating more space for younger colleagues, more productive work, bringing in, opening up the possibility for building different kind of teams and addressing important questions in transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary ways. And, opening up, trying to work against the white privilege of academia. That is sort of the everyday practice as an academic. And the other thing is, of course, to prioritize working on the important publications and the engagement with people outside and being out there to participate in various discussions and forums and seminars, instead of just trying to write as many articles per year as possible. That really makes no difference and no one will really read them or learn from them. So I think it's really an emphasis on quality. And for this, we need to really support each other because it's going to be really hard. We'll feel the pressure every day. So we have to again and again tell each other that we should focus on quality in teaching and research. And then, really create that collaborative environment. So I think we're change agents in that way.
Thanks a lot, Helena. And finally, Therese, I'll leave the last word to you and then I'll ask the panel for closing words.
I think the importance of education just keeps coming back to me at all levels, and leaving the space within educational institutions and structures to actually allow for the change that's needed at the very start, really, right through to higher education. Because I think the change that's needed is going to be so radical, given the level and the significance of the crisis we've faced, that people are going to need all sorts of skills that we didn't think that they might need. So I think that's basically.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks to everyone. Just to very quickly flag, there's a session after this one if you're interested in this topic. We have a dialogue session immediately after this, beginning at 12 noon. It's D385. So colleague Marcus it will be chairing that one. And tomorrow morning we have the paper that this session is based on, the project is based on, and that's FP 184, and it's at 10:45 tomorrow morning. So that's just to flag up that. We have literally 2 minutes left. I'm going to take a, I'll leap here. Joy, could you give us the closing words?
Okay, right, yeah, there's say don't harness grassroots movements. That's the whole nature of them, that they are not meant to be, that they are institutionalized, they're subversive. And I'm John, I'm all into subversion. That's the way that states are overthrown. And also as an academic, you can be a subversive. Don't you dare give up, Helena. I shall be very annoyed with you. And we, in a symposium we had 2 years ago, what we did was we brought together academics, policymakers, and activists. I have to say, the activists in the room changed some of my thinking on gender issues. So I think that there is room also as an academic for subversion. I went and taught, I was asked to help take a business studies study tour somewhere. Right, we're going to Vietnam. You're going to go and see something completely different to what you're used to saying. And I also took the bull by the horns, and I mentioned the word gender. And I started talking about gender roles and relations in the context of business. And at the end, I thought, I'm going to get a lot of hostility here, particularly from the guys. The women liked what I said, and the guys said to me, why haven't we heard more about this? So students, there is a hope, John. So if you teach them, if you open their eyes to it, then there is an opportunity, I think. So yeah, great session. There's lots of interesting stuff in the comments. So Marcus, I hope you can keep some of the comments stuff.
So with Chiara, we can keep the comments, yeah. Maybe Chiara has left. Huh? So I think we're at time now. We'll figure that out, Joy, and see how we can respond to the comments. Keep the comments and find some way of responding to those. So a huge thank you to everyone, to John, to Edmund, to Joy, for such a fantastic, rich discussion, and to everyone who has come on to ask questions and take part in the discussion. We hope we see you at the next session, the dialogue session 385, and maybe tomorrow morning as well, as I at FP 184.